I'm going to pass straight over to Samir to talk about Colombia.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll try to be brief as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about what stabilization actually means in the Colombian context. And I guess the idea is really to kind of think about also what kind of lessons there are for kind of stabilization more broadly, but also looking particularly at the implications that stabilization has had for civilian protection in Colombia. Now, Colombia, like Sri Lanka, doesn't really fit the fragile state label very well. On the one hand, it has a long democratic tradition. It has quite a developed market economy. It has quite a stable economic record. But at the same time, it does have a lot of associated characteristics of fragility. So the state doesn't control all of its territory. It has a prolonged armed conflict. There's a large-scale displacement crisis. And in the last 3 decades, we've seen the proliferation of organized crime and drug trafficking. So this combination of democracy, markets, and growth alongside war, violence, and organized crime is often being referred to as a Colombian puzzle. And I think how that puzzle has been understood over time has very much kind of determined the nature and scope of stabilization in Colombia. Now, in the paper, in the disasters, I focused on 3 periods. Now, the first period looks at the US aid package, the Alliance for Progress, that was launched in 1961 by President Kennedy. Now, in terms of that first period, essentially this aid package by President Kennedy was ultimately a response that there was a fear that there was going to be a potential rise of communist regimes across the continent in Latin America. And the idea was that with a program of foreign aid to promote stability through social and economic reform, they could counter that threat. So in the Colombian context, this essentially entailed providing very high visibility, kind of quick impact projects in shelter, education, etc., which with the rationale was that that would buy time, would create goodwill among the population until kind of greater reforms, particularly agrarian reforms, could take place. Now, which is quite similar to, if you like, some of the rationales between some of the Hearts and Mind projects that you see today. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail what happened, but essentially you have the president of Colombia at the time, Yas Camargo, try to instill an agrarian reform process and implement, in the meantime, these high visibility projects. But Colombia had just emerged out of a strong period called La Violencia, and out of that period of violencia basically had put together a very fragile political settlement between the 2 main parties, which was called the National Front, which essentially entailed sharing power every 4 years between the 2 main parties. So in order to carry out the reform, he needed a very broad-based coalition among the parties in order to achieve that. But there were a lot of vested interests against the reforms he was trying to push through, and ultimately, well, he was unsuccessful. Now, the US government realized that he was going to be unsuccessful, but essentially continued with the Alliance for Progress program, and particularly after the assassination of Kennedy and the ascension of Lyndon Johnson, kind of dropped the more transformative elements of the program and mainly focused on providing these kind of like short-term high visibility projects, but with strong macroeconomic support. And the idea that with macroeconomic support, they would avoid the political fallout of a balance of payments crisis. Now, I think in terms of the success of this program, we don't see the emergence of a communist revolution in Colombia, but you do see the rise of various guerrilla groups, and some of their grievances do relate around this issue of the agrarian problem. Now, and I think that has an important lesson and parallel for the period, that it's very difficult to achieve stability through development without having an inclusive political settlement, or political settlements are able to facilitate some of these processes. So in terms of the second period of stabilization, if we fast forward to the end of the 1990s, the government of Andrés Pastrana is engaging in a peace negotiation with the FARC. Now, at the time, he developed what is being called Plan Colombia. And initially, Plan Colombia was a very ambitious economic and development project that was recognized that some of the key drivers of conflict were social injustice, and in order to kind of create peace and stability, you had to tackle that social injustice. And initially, the Plan Colombia was dubbed a Marshall Plan for Colombia. But due to difficulties in getting funds through Congress in Colombia, ultimately the plan was changed quite radically and became quite a strict, slim, narrow counter-narcotics program, with 75% directed towards military aid and only 25% focused on economic and development programs. Now, initially, the Plan Colombia saw the issue of kind of counter-narcotics and counter-insurgency as distinct, but this ultimately changed after the events of 9/11 and with the rise of President Álvaro Uribe into the presidency in Colombia. And essentially, the armed conflict was essentially kind of revisioned, if you like. And the main kind of groups were ultimately seen to have lost their political motivations and were ultimately engaged in conflict due to for profit. And essentially, their involvement on the drug trade kind of justified that or proved that. So the idea was that in order to tackle the insurgency and eliminate the conflict, one had to tackle the drugs trade. And what you see is kind of a shift where the counter-narcotics and counter-insurgency agenda in Colombia ultimately merge under a banner of counter-terrorism. Similarly, as in Sri Lanka, very much effectively using the war on terror to kind of describe what was happening in Colombia. So in terms of kind of implementing the stabilization plan, ultimately it required kind of increasing the state's presence, particularly the military and police across the country, in order to effectively disable the FARC, but also to counter narcotics. Now, according to Uribe, the protection of civilians is at the heart of this program because, in his words, the most effective way of promoting human rights and protections of civilians is through the expansion of security forces across the country. And if one looks at a first glance at his democratic security policy, it has been quite successful. It has weakened the FARC. It's led to the demobilization of the paramilitaries, over 30,000 combatants. The security forces went from being present in 300 municipalities in 2006 in 2002, to being present in all municipalities in 2006. And we see between that period the numbers of murders decreasing by 44%, massacres down by 68%, and kidnappings down by 88%. But I guess before kind of taking these successes at face value, I think when discussing stabilization, it's quite important to make a distinction between when we're talking about security, is between security and protection. And I think the primary aim of these stabilization efforts ultimately is to protect the state and its international backers, particularly the US, against the threats that are understood to stem from Colombia, particularly drug trafficking. Now, why is this different to protection? And I'll give a few examples. I mean, first of all, in contrast to the guerrillas, there's a very soft approach towards the paramilitaries. And the reason is because the paramilitaries have historically supported the interests of the states. They've never actually sought to overtake the state or affect the state in that way. But they still have been involved in large-scale human rights abuses. But there has been little really political will to try and dismantle their political and economic power, particularly land issues. Now, since the 1980s, the paramilitaries have basically gone and expropriated millions of hectares of land. And as a result of that, there has been quite large-scale displacement. But there hasn't really been any efforts within stabilization to actually tackle this issue. Second, while there's nothing really new in terms of armed actors within the Colombian conflict using or carrying out terrorist acts, I think rebranding of the conflict as a fight against terrorism has certain functions. And one of those functions is ultimately to deny the existence of an armed conflict, which would allow for international humanitarian law to apply and ultimately the humanitarian space for traditional assistance and protection activities. Now, ultimately, a fight against terrorism, I guess, invokes the military and police powers of the state, often through extraordinary measures, to maintain public order and shore up security. And in effect, since 2002, Uribe tried to instigate a state of unrest. He's restricted civil liberties and ultimately limited the space to scrutinize government policies. And this has evolved essentially verbally attacking many human rights organizations, calling them defenders of terrorism. Equally, the academic community has often been labeled, particularly when they have tried to advocate for peace, the intellectual bloc of the FARC, and essentially has warned that their calls for peace are actually attempts to derail his democratic security policy. Now, in a context where some of the main threats to actual civilian populations is the accusations of collaborations, these kind of accusations are extremely serious and put civilians under extreme pressure to be able not to be perceived to be part of or allied to different groups, which can have repercussions such as arrests, assassinations, and massacres. So I think from this period of stabilization, I think that once again, similar to the Alliance for Progress, what happens is that it's essentially tried to carry out transformation, but without really tackling some of the political factors or the causes or drivers of conflict. And I think the assessment that the guerrillas are simply waging war for profit is quite ahistorical and an oversimplification of some of the complex drivers of rebellion in Colombia. Now, Furthermore, I think from a humanitarian perspective, whilst the levels of violence have decreased with these stabilization efforts, I think that some of those decreases in the levels of violence have been quite short term, and at the end of this period of stabilization we do see increases, particularly as many paramilitary groups start to remobilize and consequently engage in organized crime. And I guess kind of some of it has also been quite in a sense, it's been very much focused on some of the key urban areas in Colombia and also in some of the areas of strategic economic importance, which I guess is in stark contrast with the humanitarian imperative, which requires attention to all people based on need and not really their utility enhancing stability or security. Now, just to go on to the final period of stabilization, the government has very much recognized some of the shortfalls of the previous stabilization efforts, particularly its military focus and not really trying to bring in some of the civilian institutions into some of these areas where the state has been historically distant, and has adopted an integrated approach, and very much similar to thinking in Afghanistan, has taken on a clear hold and build strategy. And the idea is that they can clear areas of the guerrilla presence, they can bring in state institutions, they can bring services of the state, they can eradicate any narcotics and foster peace and stability and development. Now, in practice, this has been problematic in the sense that, as some of the other presentations were discussing, there's a lot of tensions between some of the objectives that are being pursued. Now, to give an example, the efforts to kind of counter narcotics has been kind of strong attempts to doing that at a very kind of short-term basis, particularly from pressure from the US. But that has had negative consequences on local economies, and particularly as they stemmed the flow of resources to some of the urban centers, which were generating employment and livelihood opportunities. Similarly, in order to promote development, the model of development that the government has is based on a rural development model is based on large-scale agribusiness, which is ultimately meant facilitating access to these cleared areas to private business, in detriment of some of the displaced populations which had their lands lost, or populations that living in those areas but haven't had tenure security, and as a result have had to flee. Some cases opening up the agricultural frontier in areas where there isn't government control, which is a historic process which has actually created some of the space for armed insurgencies to emerge, thrive and expand. So just to quickly conclude, I mean, I think the Colombian experience really highlights how there's been a disconnect between the discourse and practice of stabilization. And I don't think in terms of kind of protecting civilians and creating security. But I don't think that is necessarily inherent, and I think that when there's perceived benefits such as improved state security, then there is a tendency to kind of dismiss, if you like, concerns around violence against civilians. But I think when there is a benefit to do so, and I think making the argument that in terms of fostering kind of state-society relations and legitimacy, there is an imperative to support human rights and ensure civilian protection, then I think you can have a basis for start influencing and advocating that these stabilization efforts try to reconcile security and protection.